Australian foreign policy and in foreign policy and diplomacy, I've got a piece of assessment that is a bit more distinctive. It's a policy recommendation, so it's like a policy, a ministerial brief, except the remit is, or essentially the students are asked to identify a foreign policy issue and make a case to a minister in a brief synopsis why we should see policy change on a particular issue. The idea is that they're rewarded for making the strongest possible case, demonstrating real understanding of the contemporary implications and debates around particular policy areas, and they have to make a really coherent but punchy case for policy change. So we're lucky enough to have someone who worked in the Department of Foreign, or a tutor who used to work for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and she, in consultation with the school, she developed a sort of template for a policy brief, a sort of 2-page brief that you would give to a time-poor minister. The idea being this is something that actually there's a particular art form to being able to construct something like this where there's no in-text references. When you're trying to get your point across as simply and as coherently as possible, there's boxes and circles for yes, no, if the minister agrees. You have to think about things like budget, and you have to take a contemporary political issue and make it. So the example she gave at the time in 2011 was that Australia should end its ban on the trade of uranium with India, and that was then used as a template for the assessment down the track, and other students since have sort of been using that. They develop skills that are specifically relevant to what employers are looking for. So in the instance of, I've had individuals from who've gone through the grad program at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, or indeed in Queensland, in the Queensland Public Service, who fed back that the policy recommendation exercise was incredibly useful because they were asked to actually draft a policy brief to communicate to a minister. So that form of assessment, especially to someone who's time poor, is actually really, it does, I think, help them in that sense. In terms of the pedagogical philosophy, it's about trying to make sure that students are developing skills that are directly relevant to what they'll experience on the outside. And I actually think essays serve that purpose really well as well, because employers want people who can research, who can communicate, who can synthesise a lot of material, but some of these are about the more practical day-to-day stuff you might be doing in areas directly related to the courses. Disadvantages are always around understanding and expectation. Students are time poor and they're creatures of habit, really. I think they like, that at some level the certainty of the existing activities is something that appeals to a lot of them. The knowledge that you're going to enrol in a class, you're going to turn up to tutorials and get a mark for that, and do a major essay and get a mark for that, and do a central exam and get a mark from that, and that's probably going to be about it. There's an attraction to that. Even to us, it would make life a bit easier, but then that you don't get a lot of the extra sort of value added around the degree. In that sense, especially with these types of courses where you're talking about the practices of world politics, if there's any sort of sense that actually this is what we're learning in class isn't directly relevant to those practices, then that would be a worse outcome than them struggling getting their heads around a piece of assessment. Because students are unfamiliar with these forms of assessment, the policy recommendation exercise, I've never provided as much information on what a piece of assessment actually is than I do with this, and I consistently get the feedback that it's not clear what it is. And essentially this is because students aren't used to it, so it jumps out at them as an unusual form of assessment, and no matter how many examples you provide online, and there's usually 3 or 4 on Blackboard, no matter how sort of much detail there is around the assessment criteria, there is still this sense that we don't quite know what we're doing. So there's a lot of, so that creates 2 problems. One, you do get pushback about this form of assessment, and sometimes it actually does. I'm convinced that it can affect even things like how they evaluate a course. So it's one of those unfortunate times where often you'll get students down the track get in touch. I've had instances where some have emailed me down the track and said, that piece of assessment was really, really useful for getting in this position, or, for helping me develop the type of skills that are relevant to a grad policy application. But at the time, it's annoying that I have to get my head around something that I've never done before. So that's one thing. The other thing, because of that, the amount of time that you have to invest in making sure that students are aware. So in Australian foreign policy, for example, I set aside, I think it was a 4-hour block, one semester, basically, with student after student just coming through saying, this is my idea, does it make sense? So there's a lot more that you have to do with that than other forms of assessment. Over-preparation in the first instance is probably wise. Don't expect students to love innovative forms of assessment the first time on. Expect to spend a lot of time explaining what you're actually trying to do and why, and then spend a lot more time allowing students to give you feedback about it. And even then, it's probably unrealistic to expect it to be perfect the first time around. So looking at those evaluations very closely, and even developing sort of ad hoc forms of evaluation and feedback opportunities throughout after that piece of assessment can be quite useful to make sure you get it right. With the policy recommendation, I want it to look as much as possible like a policy brief that a minister would get. So there's no references in text, because of course that's not really how you'd communicate. You don't need to back up your points, and even though that's of course totally inconsistent with most of what academic writing is about. So they have to provide a bibliography indicating which sources they've drawn from. But in instances where they've copied and pasted from other sources, that then becomes tricky, because in a sense I've told them not to reference and I make it clear when I'm walking them through the form of assessment that actually really shouldn't block quote from anything. And even if you do quote, then that's an instance to say here's a quote from someone. But you still get instances where students might do it and it becomes, I think there's enough ambiguity around it that frankly I'd be slightly worried if anything was serious and did escalate, that students could use the form of assessment as a way of getting out of any disciplinary hearing associated with it. So in a sense it might happen, but it might actually be more difficult to prosecute, as it were. I think within the discipline it's very easy to see something like, especially policy briefings, it's kind of within political science, it'd be fairly easy to do. And even in broader humanities arts, I would imagine that there might be scope to do something like that. One of the things I like about my school is that effectively there is a lot of interaction with colleagues about those things, and some of us have experience with delivering this stuff that actually you don't. It's not until you're in a situation where you're all in the same room talking about this that you think actually that could work in my course, or I do something similar.